Welcome everybody to this second symposium of our AHRC funded project. I won't just read out what's written in front of you, you can do that for yourselves, but it's with great pleasure I welcome our three keynote speakers for the morning session. They'll each have approaching 40 minutes to present whatever they wish and to answer your questions as well. And I'm particularly grateful to Simon Durrant, who stepped in for Eduardo Miranda. I said to Eduardo, there's nobody like you who covers all the many disciplines that we're interested in getting into this. And he said, yes, I know the person you should contact. Simon studied with Eduardo and has degrees in neuroscience and music and crosses those very same boundaries. Without more ado, welcome to Gary Kendall from Belfast to launch our symposium for the day.
Okay. And I want to say it was a great benefit looking at the video, the documentary of the previous symposium. Fabulous symposium. Wish I had been there. And the few conversations I had with Simon about things that went on there were a big influence in framing what I wanted to talk about today. So here's my agenda. I want to talk about meaning in electroacoustic music. And automatically I'm going to reset my display because it isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing here. Hold on a second. Let's quit this. Why aren't you? I'm sorry. Quit. Because it's not showing. It's not showing the notes. Play slideshow. Sorry, no notes. I don't understand why not. Okay, hold on. Let's try that again. And if not, go back to playing it, huh? Okay, well, back one. Okay, here we go, my agenda. I want to talk about meaning in electroacoustic music, and I want to talk about specifically in terms of mental processes, and I want to be introducing a kind of a model of mental processing for music that has 5 layers to it, and then I want to connect that in some way to definitions of feeling, emotional, and phenomenal qualities in the arts. And then mostly then connect those to an application, which is looking at one section of Stockhausen's composition Taylor music, looking at structure 16, and applying the information from those other 2 topic areas to that. And finally, I want to end up talking about the aesthetic blend. Of course, in all of this, I'm talking about meaning, feeling, emotion, and aesthetic experience. I hope by the end, I've made a reasonable job of connecting all of these together. So, back, here we go. Forward. Oh, that doesn't seem to be working. Let's do this. Okay, so I want to start off with what I think is a sort of pragmatic notion of meaning, which is that meaning is what we make of an artwork. And what we make of an artwork is its meaning to us. So I'm not talking about meaning that's somehow externalized out there in the environment. I'm talking about the meaning making that we make as human beings. And my goal here is to arrive at an account of how mental processes, by which the listener experiences meaning, to account for those mental processes, and especially how emotion and phenomenal qualities would be integral to that sense of meaning. And I have a quote here from Merlin Donald, and I think this captures a lot of the idea. He says, a major objective driving what might be termed the cognitive deconstruction of artistic experience, you got that? The cognitive deconstruction of artistic experience is to analyze the functional architecture of its underlying component operations. So this is essentially what I'm going to try to do here. And I want to start off by pointing that a listener's mental activities occur on multiple levels simultaneously. So any practical, realistic account of meaning making has to account for the different levels at which people are processing information. So I want to talk about these from the simplest sensory processes proceeding up to the most synoptic and abstract. And here's a bit of a diagram trying to explain both in a synopsis form what each of these 5 layers are, what I view them functionally as doing, and then a little bit about what their productions are, because at the level of each of these layers, they're each making meaning in their own way. They're each producing meaningful information from the viewpoint of their their own level of processing. So they produce different kinds of meaning. So we could start at the top with sensation. And I'm saying that the layer of sensation is that which provides constancy and perceptual organization of immediate sensation. So this is a level that which we don't have as much conscious influence, but certainly as acoustic activity is transduced into neural activity and produces sensations, this is the level I'm talking about. And its processing, what it does in terms of organization, is to produce perceptual bindings and groupings, things like auditory streams, perceptual events, what are called gestalted forms, and these things have perceptual features. So those are the things I want to associate with sensation. And then there's another level, which I call the gist, which is the framework of things in space, extended over several seconds and enabling sustained awareness in the short term. So at the level of sensation, I might have an experience of something that involved a combination of components that was very much in high frequency, and I recognized that this thing was some sort of perceptual event. But the level of gist, I would recognize that it was a trumpet, for instance. Okay? And so what kind of meaning is produced at the level of gist? I would say instance schemas for things. Things could be objects, things could be people, so it's things in a broad sense, but are schemas for what the things are in the world around us. Short-term events, which might be something broader than just perceptual events. The properties of objects and forces. And if nothing else, one of the other important attributes of gist is that it takes this simplified information, compressing all of the information from sensation, compressing it down into a limited number of objects, and arranging them in some way where we understand, for instance, that there's foreground and background. That would be part of the gist. And then there's a layer I want to call locus, which I describe as a framework for near-term self-governance of listening, in which you identify that things have trajectories and they have significance. So at some point, there's a further, you say, a compression of information. When I get down to the point of now I have to sort of say, well, what's going on? What am I going to attend to? And one of the major things that locus produces is, you might say, levels of significance that would tell us what we should focus on and what we should ignore, for instance. Beyond that, I'm describing a layer I call context, which is a framework for building schematic relationships, including long-term event-oriented schemas, things that create expectations over extended time. Well, so locus may have some short-term expectation. At the level at which we start thinking about context and which time is abstract, then we have the possibility of building up notions of expectation, anticipating what might be the consequence of something fitting into a pattern that we're experiencing right now. So what does context produce? It produces instances of event-oriented schemas. That's things that have to do with evolution through time. That could be musical and auditory patterns. It produces predictions and expectations. And though I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, this is also the level at which I think we would talk about signification, signs, and cognitive blending. And then finally, what I'll call abstraction, a framework for holding the schemas of background meta-knowledge, systems, domains, things like what's a musical language, what belongs in it, what's in a composer's style. So these are schemas for long-term knowledge, and this might be the place that we would locate aesthetic bindings, but that's something I'll talk about as we're going along here. So we have these five layers going on. They're all going on simultaneously, but of course one of the other things that has to happen is that the information that they're all producing, all of these products, have to be harmonized with one another. And especially there's a drive to make sure we've accommodated everything that's coming from sensation. So you can imagine there's some process by which when things change or something important happens that you signal sort of up and down the chain of command signaling change so that one layer can adjust the changes in another. And some specific example of how these kinds of connections would be made. For instance, we could say that sensation connects sensation to instances of schemas for things in space at the level of gist. So at gist, if I'm focusing something at gist, then it also has the capacity to connect back to the corresponding sensations. So I can go from the sensations to trumpet and trumpet back to the sensations again. And if in the level of gist, I know that there's a trumpet, that is an active item that would get passed on to locus, and locus would have to decide what it's going to do with that. Does this make sense? So that's the broad outline, so 5 layers. Other cognitive scientists could come up with 5 or 6 or more, and there's all kinds of versions of this, I think, that are comparable. So let me turn the corner now and talk about feeling and emotion. So let's talk about a general definition here. Feeling. Feeling generally refers to the subjective experience of emotion and, well, let me talk about just emotion for a second. And some things we can say about emotion. We know that emotion's connected to biology, biological function. We know that changes in emotion are correlated with changes in the physiological state of the body. And there's an explanation for that. We could say that, in fact, emotion might be tied to a system by which we adjust the physiological state of the body to anticipate circumstances. If I'm feeling fear helps to bring the body into a state to deal with fear. It causes the adrenaline to rush. What else do we know about emotion? We know that it's broadly categorical. That there are some categories that have been described in terms of the emotional categories. Sometimes these are described as happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise. Those are the original ones that were described by Ekman, but other people have described other categories and used different terms like happy, elated, sad, melancholic, calm, content, nostalgic, longing, aroused, alert. So there's a general acceptance, I think, that things are categorical, but exactly what the categories are and how many there are, well, that's still subject for debate and research. And another thing is that we know that emotion is affected by relatively high-level cognitive processes. And the most common theory for talking about emotion is assessment, where you make some assessment. Okay, here I am now, I'm thinking about the future, I'm making a connection, how is my well-being going to change under the circumstances that I perceive, and that maybe I think things are going to be better, so I'm happy, or I think things are going to be worse for me, or I'm sad. So assessment inherently involves some sort of comparison of points in time, and it's situational. And I'm sure these are all things that that Simon's going to talk about much more later. So I'm just basically touching on these. What's important, I think, for me is the notion that assessment can be related to Leonard Meyer's theories about musical expectation and patterns in music, and anticipating patterns and having patterns thwarted. So I don't want to say much about that, but we'll return to the Stockhouse and we'll be able to look at an example, I think, that engages at this level. So, back to my definition. Feeling. Feeling generally refers to the subjective experience of emotion, and I want to say phenomenal qualities, and put a lot more emphasis on phenomenal qualities as being important for electroacoustic music. So, what do I mean by phenomenal qualities? Well, I think, once again, connected to biology and biological function. If I'm taking the sensations of the body, which is millions of little sensations, and I have to say to myself, well, how is my body feeling? I feel the blend of all these things, and I can experience this in some sort of a way that helps me understand the state of the body. So that's useful for biology. And clearly it's not categorical, because when I'm calling phenomenal qualities, favor the particularity and the blending of these qualities over the categorization that occurs with emotion. So one term that's often associated with these phenomenal qualities is qualia, which is usually described as components of sense perception. And I would be tempted to just use that word, except that there's a long history of discussion of whether qualia exists or don't exist. And So set that aside. Qualia are raw feelings, and they're not typically discussed in terms of dynamic properties. So that seems to me something really important for electroacoustic music. What I call flow dynamics, the living quality of sensory experiences, the changing, the related changes in energy and effort and state, the kinds of things I think that we all sense when we're involved feeling what happens in events in the physical world. So, for instance, a lot of other people have done work that you could say is related to this. For instance, Daniel Stern has a notion of what he calls vitality effect contours. And quoting from Mark Johnson, not classic emotions, the patterns of process and flow of our felt experience. So I want to talk about how important that I think that is for electroacoustic music. So, emotion, phenomenal qualities. I think it's very important that we recognize in everyday life we experience these two together. We experience some sort of blend of these two. And these phenomenal qualities, to me, give nuance to emotion. If emotion's categorical, then I never perceive just the raw states of emotion, but it's emotion blended with some phenomenal qualities of the moment. Then I think, too, that emotion gives some sort of overall shape to these phenomenal qualities. And I'm not sure, that we give proper cognizance to that. Certainly, every experience is marked by emotion, though you could say sometimes the arousal level is zero. That there was emotion there, but it was basically not so present. But certainly, all experience is intrinsically rooted in phenomenal qualities. Everything is phenomenal qualities. And I would make what I think is sort of an overall, maybe overreaching statement that contemporary art is generally more focused on creating realms of phenomenal qualities than emotions. Maybe that's one reason why a lot of the research on music and emotion is about, historical music. So, something about why this is all important. New aesthetic integrations. I'll just read this. One of the reasons why we value art is that the result of an artistic experience is a new sense of possibility, new integrations, even if ineffable. Ineffable because the new integrations become an unobservable part of the listener's cognitive unconscious, part of the listener's repertoire for apprehending everything around them. And of course, emotion and phenomenal qualities are intrinsically part of new artistic integrations. I'm saying that, in fact, one of the reasons that we pay attention to art, we engage in art, is that we're bringing to ourselves these new integrations. So, going back to the level, the model of the 5 layers, I have here some terms describing felt qualities, emotional characteristics that will be coming up in the example we'll look at. I just want to make the point that at the levels of sensation and gist, that's where you mostly are encountering phenomenal qualities. And that, for the most part, emotion, I would say, would be associated with projections about the future and which require some sort of patterns across time, at least for emotions as engaged by assessment. And that aesthetic integrations, how these things integrate, well, I'm thinking are probably at the level of abstraction, but still thinking about that. So let's deal with an example. This is the score, Stockhausen's score to Structure 16 from Taylor Music. And it's one of 32 structures that make up the piece. And like all of them, its length is a Fibonacci number. In this case, actually, the sum of 2 Fibonacci numbers is 55 plus 2 equals 57. We're fortunate in having a score for this. One thing I can say in general about the structures is that every one of them begins with some sort of a strike on a tempo instrument. So this one begins with a strike on a rin, which is actually a bowl, but it sounds like a bell. And this is a realization score, but I think it's interesting to look at. Most of the content of Structure 16 is ring modulation of Japanese gaga-ku music. None of it recognizable as such, because the ring modulation shifts it all up between 5K and 7K, so there's this very high band of textured sound, this clustery sound, that is actually gaga-ku, but nobody would ever know that. So let's take a listen. And I want to play the end of structure 15, structure 16, and then go into the beginning of structure 17. Okay? Just so we hear the transition to the next section. So now we're in the structure 17. And you know, you can tell one of the reasons why I picked this example is that the last 20 seconds has no change in it whatsoever. So I'm curious to talk about what's happening in terms of mental processes during that 20 seconds, during which there's virtually no acoustic change. Okay? Here's a sonogram for structure 16. Here are those high frequency clusters. And then here are the first, second, and third of these sort of melodic features that come in and interrupt structure 16. It's basically retuning some of the ring modulation and bring material down into melodic range and then shifting back up again. So I want to deal with this in terms of what we could imagine the mental activities of a reasonably informed listener to be listening to Taylor music and encountering structure 16. I want to think of it in terms of largely three phases. One phase, you know, all the way through the structure until we pretty much get into this area where nothing's happening, and then consider what kinds of mental changes must be happening during that 20 seconds. So let's start at the beginning with phase one. And I imagine, you know, that if we talk about the bell at the very, very beginning, we would say, well, at the level of sensation, there's a new perceptual event. And over here on the right, I've written in red, you know, terms that I think would describe, you know, phenomenal qualities or emotive properties of these different layers. So it's impulsive and sustained. And this new perceptual event at the level of gist would be a bell that had struck, and the bell is now in the foreground. At the level of locus, you would attend to the bell. At the level of context, you would say, well, the bell fits the pattern of signifying a section beginning. I've learned that through 15 previous sections. So other pattern fits are unlikely, and therefore close out section 15 because we've already got the end of it. And at the level of abstraction, you would say, well, this matches the domain of Taylor music. Everything is sort of normative up at this point. And then after the bell, when the bell has died out, you realize that there's also this ongoing auditory stream that's high and it's rough. And the bell was foreground. The gist has to decide, you know, what else is there. The clusters are flickering, but okay, locus, what do? Do we attend to the clusters? You ask context. Context says no, because all the way through the piece, the clusters have not been the foreground. They've been the background. So, you know, listen for the next event, because there's going to be some pattern initiated probably. So locus decides to ignore clusters. The bell was in the foreground. Now we're waiting for the next thing that's going to be in the foreground. And we have relatively, at the beginning of this, relatively high certainty about everything, and everything's consistent with what we expect in Taylor music. And we go on to the first melodic event. So at the level of sensation. So there's something new in the mid-range that's been added. Now we have two different things that are going on, two different auditory streams. Yes recognizes this as some sort of melodic tone group that's in the foreground. locus will attend to the melodic sequence and ignore the clusters. In context, we must say, oh, this melodic sequence is probably the beginning of a pattern of some sort. So other things are unlikely. Nothing's really changed. At a level of abstraction, we would say, well, we're still within the domain of things that are typical of Taylor music. So by the time the melodic event is over, there's still an ongoing stream. The melodic tones were foreground. The clusters are still in the background. Other things unchanged. Okay, so then we get to the second melodic event. And of course, sensation, gist, and locus are pretty much the same as before. At the level of context, we must say, though, aha, now I've had two of these. I have a pattern going here. So I now can make a high pattern hypothesis, and I can make a projection into the future. My projection is, if we've done it twice, we're going to do it a third time. I'm an average listener. At the level of abstraction, everything is fine. And at the end of this, I think we're left anticipating the next event and thinking that everything is pretty much fine, except that the absence of other events going on is not like the rest of Taylor music. Something's a little odd going on here. By the time we get to the third melodic event, sensation, gist, and locus are like before. At the level of context, we've now confirmed our pattern. We've had 3 instances of these melodic events. We have pattern confirmation. We feel very secure in that. But at the level of abstraction, we must be thinking, where are the other events? There's nothing else going on. This is atypical of the rest of the piece. So now we're getting to a point where things don't seem entirely consistent with the rest of Taylor music. And then, then we get into this phase where we're looking for the next thing to happen. So we go into phase 2. And locus is focusing for the next foreground event. What's going to happen? Something has to happen. And after waiting for a while, locus wakes up and says, nothing's happened. I'm waiting for an event, but no events have occurred. So, of course, now context has to adjust to this. And at context, you have to say, well, my anticipation of the next event has been thwarted. I have to launch some sort of a new search for a new pattern. I have to anticipate that something's going to come. At the level of abstraction, maybe you're realizing that the sparseness and the absence of continuation isn't like any of the rest of Taylor music. This is completely different. And now this is highly inconsistent, and I have very low certainty about what I'm doing. Locus is trying to find events. It's been ignoring the clusters. It looks to gist to say, what else is going on here? But at gist, there's only one item. So if there's only one item, it's kind of ambiguous whether something's foreground or background, right? There's only one thing there. So there's nothing new coming up from sensation. I'm trying to find something, but there isn't anything. And so gist finally has to make the decision and come around. The locus has to come around to the decision of deciding that it's going to focus on the clusters. And we're looking for some new pattern here. All of this going on while there's no acoustic change. Then finally, after a while, we settle into, I think, a new regimen. We say sensation knows there's an ongoing stream. At the level of gist, these clusters are in the foreground. They're bright and coarse, and I'm trying to hear something in them. Locus is trying to anticipate some change, but there is no change. There's nothing changing hardly at all. Context is trying to find a pattern, but there's no increase or decrease of anything. I seem to be in stasis, So there's no clear expectation. I don't know what's going to come next. At the level of abstraction, we must be thinking to ourselves, well, the absence of continuation doesn't match Taylor music at all. I'm up in the air at this point. And I've been going through these mental operations sort of sequentially by slices, but I want to just show a different representation so I could just as well, for instance, follow context all the way through these last 20 seconds and also show how the messages get passed back and forth, or conceptual messages get passed back and forth, as at these different levels of mental activity, they're trying to harmonize and make some sense. They're trying to make some meaning of what's going on, make some meaning of it. This is meaning making. And then finally, structure 17 comes in, and we say, well, there's a new perceptual event. Just says it was a woodblock. And locus says, I'm going to attend to the wood block. And context says, oh, now we have a wood block that fits the pattern of a section beginning, good. Therefore, close out the previous section, whatever that was, close it out. At the level of abstraction, we say, well, the integration of structure 16 is absorbed now into our long-term memory. The domain of Taylor music has to expand to include the possibility that this is something that could happen. And then some new aesthetic integration has occurred. All of this has some sense of feeling and emotional content to it that's now been added to my cognitive unconscious. So let's listen again. Okay. So during that 20 seconds, do you find your attention shifting to putting the clusters in the foreground, where you start listening to the clusters and the detail, and you're trying to follow them and make some sense out of them? Yeah, I think anyone normally following this suddenly finds themselves at. It's the shift of attention we don't usually attend to or describe. And I think too, once you listen to this several times, I would want to go back and redraw all those connections, because I think that subsequent listenings would free up mental resources to invest in other aspects of how you listen to this. So, some reflections. During that 20 seconds of almost no acoustic change, a reasonably informed listener's mental processes do change, especially in response to expectations. And I think too that the clusters shift from background to foreground in that context. The overall experience of structure 16 progresses from sparse to sparser in very odd contrast to the rest of the piece as a whole. And also in structure 16, we seem to go from high certainty and high consistency to low certainty and low consistency. And so it's an open-ended progression without closure. The listener's evolution, I think, is not like a vector so much as it's sort of spinning off course until finally, structure 17 comes in. And if we think about this from the level of assessment, focusing on just what kind of assessment is being made, going from that, certainty into a high level of uncertainty is really something analogous to evoking fear. And I think that maybe in the middle of this structure, it could have become fearful if something had grown in intensity, if something had reinforced that, but in fact, nothing reinforces that at all. So you're left just sort of hanging with that feeling of uncertainty. And for me, there's an emergent emotional phenomenal sense produced by that combination of the fear-tinged unpredictability along with the uncertainty of the direction, the strange sparseness of the texture, and the incongruity with the rest of the work. And and for me at least, that feeling I get is something like mysterious. This section, structure 16, is mysterious. It's mysterious, in terms of where I'm orienting myself, but also thinking about what strange decisions Stockhausen has made to make structure 16 the way that it is. So I've always experienced it as somewhat mysterious. No, so the question is meaning, going back to meaning. The structure 16's meaning reside in the fact that it's mysterious, Well, yes, that seems to be a word that you could say. There's something here that's an integration of all of this that is akin to mysteriousness. But there's also, I think, for me, an emergent quality that's situated here in the specific constituents of the sensory materials, the mental processes. All this together, to me, forms a blend. Some kind of a blend has occurred. I want to say, let's say this is the aesthetic blend, that I have a feeling sense of this whole section. It hears and makes some sort of sense to me. I sense an aesthetic blend, something which I think is a fundamental property of being human and the very deepest kind of meaning making. I made meaning out of structure 16. So the aesthetic blend, here's all these elements, I think that went into this. It's just not mysteriousness, but mysteriousness against this high, rough sound, and this strange contrast of melodicness against that, going from high certainty to low certainty, going from a context which is confirmed to one that isn't, something which is consistent to highly inconsistent, And I'm thinking, what is this man doing? Why did he put this piece together this way? Something mysterious, some hidden logic must be there, I think, behind all of this. So, for me, this is at least a way of beginning to think about an aesthetic blend. And here's a quote from Terence Deacon, I think is relevant. He says, 2 ways in which I would like to augment blend theory from cognitive science to be in better consonance with this approach to aesthetic cognition emotion in parallel, joined together. The first is to link it to a theory of emergent emotional states. That is, to recognize the inescapable interweaving and interdependency of the dimensions of mind that we typically divide into cognition and emotion. Say these two have to be taken together. And the second is to recast it in dynamic terms. And I think that's exactly what we've just done here. We've done exactly what Terence Deacon said was needing to be done. So, aesthetic blend. Somehow I can get into the aesthetic blend. It's open for me because it's somewhat glued together by its feeling qualities. For me, integrating emotion and phenomenal qualities with a specific artistic event and producing, therefore, emergent properties. So what I think electroacoustic analysis needs now is a theory of the aesthetic blend, acknowledging that meaning is a product of mental processes which are embedded with the full range of feeling qualities. Okay? I say thank you, and we have a minute or two.
Thank you very much, Gary. Perfect timing. Can I invite Mike to come up and set up while...
Can someone turn down audio while we...
I haven't a clue how you do that.
Okay, we do it quickly is what we do.
Questions briefly. Alas, we will have opportunities to talk to Gary in breaks and at the end of the day. But are there any immediate questions?
Lee.
Gary, it's going to take me a while to come to grips with all the terminology, but I think the one that I have to come to grips for, and I may not be the only one, is your use of phenomenal quality.
Yeah.
I'll cast the question and just tell me whether I'm way off.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about aesthetics, and since we both know the strange path that word has taken over the last few centuries, I'm wondering whether the phenomenal qualities that you're referring to are largely associated with the younger definition of aesthetics, that is to do with a greater understanding of work and workness, as opposed to the more emotional, traditional aesthetic qualities that we just deal with the beauty and all the rest.
Lee,
I think I'm on this point.
Right on a difficult point for me, because this is the 4th word I think I've tried to use here. And I started off saying, well, let's just talk about it as feeling. And I'll use the word feeling, and I'll say, I'm going to define feeling as different from emotion. There's emotion, there's feeling. And then, well, that doesn't work too well with a lot of different fields. It certainly doesn't work with music and emotion. So let's try some other words. What about qualia? I mean, that's, if I look at a definition of qualia, that's a good word. And then you read all the history on it. You say, do they exist or not? Do qualia exist? Anyway, so I haven't found the right word yet. If I could find the right word, if you could suggest a better word for me, I would be happy. I was looking for the most neutral way of evoking this I could, because while it seems like lots of different fields touch on this, they touch on sensation and the organization of sensation. They approach it with different ways, different debates, and different histories. So, darn, I wish I could just find a neutral word. Invent one for me, please. Okay?
Well, I think what I was trying to do with the question, Gary, was
Yeah.
to see, when we looked at Kendall, what we were doing, we're dealing with levels of predictability. in a
Yes,
sense.
at one level.
But that's dealing with the work and what we're getting out of the work, what we think we're hearing in the work, what we think we're expecting of the work, which is not in the first instance emotional, but could be in the second instance.
It's definitely potentially evocative of emotion.
Yes.
But that when you listen to those clusters with their roughness and their shimmeriness, I'm invoking that emotion in the context of that being there also. I can't segregate these two so easily.
I'm sorry to say we will move on so that you do have time to have a lunch break. Thank you very much, Gary.